Harlem, New York. 2:47 p.m. Thursday, August 14, 1952. The summer heat pressed down on 125th Street like a physical weight, turning the asphalt soft underfoot and making the air shimmer with exhaust fumes and desperation. The smell of roasted peanuts from street vendors mixed with the sour tang of overflowing garbage cans and the metallic scent of impending violence. Outside Small's Paradise, dice games had paused mid-roll. Conversations died in barbershop doorways. Even the traffic seemed to slow, as if the entire neighborhood sensed that something irreversible was about to unfold. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stood on the sidewalk in a charcoal gray suit tailored on Lenox Avenue, every thread worth more than most men earned in a month. At 45, he controlled every numbers operation, every policy bank, every protection arrangement from 110th Street to the Polo Grounds. His silk pocket square was the color of dried blood. His shoes reflected the afternoon sun like black mirrors. He wasn't talking. He wasn't moving. He was simply present, with the kind of stillness that made smart men cross the street. At 2:49 p.m., the squad car turned the corner too fast, tires squealing against hot asphalt. Captain Gerald O'Malley stepped out like a man declaring war. Irish. Third-generation nipped. His father had broken skulls during the draft riots. His grandfather had burned out the 5 Points gangs with systematic brutality. O'Malley stood 5'9" in polished boots, with a face like a clenched fist and eyes that had watched Harlem transform from Italian territory to Negro territory with barely concealed rage. He'd been captain of the 32nd Precinct for 8 months, and in those 8 months, he'd made it clear that the old arrangements were finished. No more envelopes, no more blind eyes, no more respect for men he considered animals in expensive suits. The crowd formed a silent semicircle. Shopkeepers, churchwomen, numbers runners, children who should have been in school. They knew what was coming. In Harlem, when Bumpy Johnson and a police captain occupied the same piece of sidewalk, the air itself became combustible. O'Malley walked straight toward him, heavy boots clicking against concrete like a countdown timer. Bumpy didn't move. "You think you run this block, boy?" O'Malley's voice carried across the street, designed for maximum humiliation, engineered for public submission. "You uppity NS forget your place sometimes." The word landed like a physical blow. The crowd went silent. Someone's radio cut off mid-song. A woman let out a quiet gasp. O'Malley leaned closer, his breath hot with cheap whiskey and cigarette smoke. "This street belongs to me. These people belong to me. And you? You're just another monkey in a $1,000 suit." Bumpy's face remained perfectly calm. No tightened jaw. No clenched fists. Just that steady, unblinking stare that people in Harlem had learned to fear more than screaming or threats. Then it happened. The slap. O'Malley's open palm cracked against Bumpy's face with the sound of a gunshot. The silk pocket square fluttered to the sidewalk like a wounded bird. Bumpy's head turned with the impact, but his feet never moved. His expression never changed. "Pick it up," O'Malley sneered, pointing at the fallen square. "On your knees, boy." The crowd held its breath. This was the moment that would define everything that came after. Bumpy looked down at the pocket square. Then, slowly, he looked back up at O'Malley. No anger, no humiliation, just calculation. He bent, not to his knees, but just enough to retrieve the silk with 2 fingers. He dusted it off with deliberate precision, refolded it, and placed it back in his jacket pocket. He straightened his tie. Then he spoke, his voice flat and stripped of all emotion. "Captain O'Malley, you just signed something you can't read yet." O'Malley laughed. The ugly, careless laughter of a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. At 2:53 p.m., O'Malley climbed back into his squad car and drove away, still chuckling. He had no idea that 47 witnesses were memorizing every detail. No idea that the story would spread through every barbershop, number spot, and church basement in Harlem before sunset. No idea that this moment, this slap, would be the last time he ever humiliated Bumpy Johnson. 18 hours and 14 minutes later, at 9:07 a.m. Friday, August 15, 1952, the 32nd Precinct station house would be a smoking ruin. And pinned to what remained of Captain O'Malley's office door, firefighters would find a single piece of paper with 7 words written in precise handwriting: "Respect is not requested. It is enforced." The story of how Captain Gerald O'Malley lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now, let's go back to Thursday, August 14th, 1952. In 1950s Harlem, law and crime shared a table every Monday morning. Before the city fully woke, precinct captains across Manhattan received plain manila envelopes containing crisp bills that smelled of policy ink and numbers racket profits. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Police decided which gambling operations could run, which after-hours clubs served liquor past closing time. In exchange, the envelopes arrived on schedule, thick enough to supplement a captain's modest salary, but thin enough to avoid federal attention. It was corruption, certainly, but it was predictable corruption. In Harlem, where chaos meant blood on the streets, predictability had value. Everyone played their role. No one spoke about it. Until Captain Gerald O'Malley decided to burn the whole arrangement to the ground. O'Malley was carved from Hell's Kitchen granite, the grandson of a beat cop who had cracked skulls during the draft riots, and the son of a detective who believed a badge was a license to hunt. He had grown up watching his father count envelope money at the kitchen table, watching him drink himself stupid on payoff whiskey, watching him die at 52 with a bloated liver and nothing to show for 30 years except a widow's pension. When O'Malley joined the force in 1935, he made himself a promise. He would be different. He would be clean. He would restore honor to a badge his family had turned into a prop for organized crime. By the time he made captain in January 1952, assigned to the 32nd Precinct covering Central Harlem, he had never taken a bribe, never looked the other way, never compromised his vision of what police work should be. His superiors considered him rigid, but effective. His fellow officers called him a Boy Scout and avoided working with him whenever possible. O'Malley's war against Bumpy Johnson began the first week of February. He raided a policy bank on 135th Street, arresting 4 runners and confiscating $12,000. 2 weeks later, he hit another operation on 8th Avenue, bringing newspaper photographers to document stacks of money spread across precinct desks. In March, he personally arrested one of Bumpy's top lieutenants outside a barbershop during peak hours when sidewalks were crowded with witnesses. Each raid was calculated for maximum publicity. O'Malley wanted Bumpy to understand that the old arrangements were finished. The envelopes would no longer buy protection. Harlem would be cleaned up, one arrest at a time, whether the criminals wore expensive suits or not. What O'Malley failed to grasp was Bumpy Johnson's unique position in Harlem's criminal ecosystem. Bumpy had backing from the Genovese crime family, the Italian organization that controlled most of Manhattan's organized crime. He had negotiated something unusual: operational autonomy in exchange for percentage payments, giving him protection that other black criminals lacked. More importantly, Harlem's community viewed him not as a predator, but as a shield. When white loan sharks tried to operate in black neighborhoods, Bumpy drove them out. When racist cops beat numbers runners for sport, Bumpy made sure those cops faced consequences. He was a criminal, certainly, but he was their criminal. He kept worse predators away. The specific incident that triggered the confrontation involved a missing envelope. On Monday, August 11th, someone left $500 on O'Malley's desk anyway, the traditional offering that every captain before him had accepted without question. O'Malley had the envelope dusted for fingerprints, found none, and burned the money in his office trash can while 3 officers watched in stunned silence. He interpreted the envelope as a test, proof that Bumpy Johnson still believed he could buy his way out of accountability. The missing payment that followed was, in O'Malley's mind, open defiance. Thursday morning, August 14th, began with a raid that went wrong in every possible way. O'Malley hit a basement apartment on 127th Street, expecting to find betting slips and cash. Instead, he found an elderly war widow in her nightgown and no evidence whatsoever. The tip had been false. Someone had made him look foolish. Someone had fed him bad intelligence knowing he would act on it. O'Malley knew exactly who that someone was. At 2:43 p.m., cruising down 7th Avenue, O'Malley spotted the charcoal gray suit outside Small's Paradise. Bumpy Johnson, standing like he owned the pavement beneath his feet, calm and completely unafraid. To O'Malley, that lack of fear was the ultimate transgression. He turned to his driver, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that promised violence. "Stop the car." Today, that uppity N learns who runs Harlem. Marcus Williams had been rolling dice on that corner for 15 years, and he knew when to fold. The moment O'Malley's squad car jerked to a stop, the ivory cubes froze in his palm. He didn't finish the roll. He didn't collect his winnings. He simply watched the captain step out with the measured stride of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his head for weeks. Across the street, Loretta Mae Johnson gripped the handle of her ice cart with arthritic fingers. At 68, she had witnessed every variety of Harlem violence, but something about O'Malley's posture made her stomach clench. This wasn't routine harassment. This was execution, performed for an audience. 15-year-old Jerome Patterson should have been sweeping floors at the barbershop. Instead, he stood transfixed outside Small's Paradise, watching his hero face down the law. Jerome had memorized every story about Bumpy Johnson, every legend of respect commanded through quiet strength. Now he was about to witness either vindication or destruction. O'Malley didn't approach. He invaded. His voice carried across 125th Street with calculated volume, designed for maximum witnesses. He called Bumpy Boy. He used the word that had been weaponized for generations, each syllable pronounced with surgical precision. He wanted humiliation. He wanted submission. He wanted Bumpy to swing first, to provide legal justification for what would follow. Bumpy gave him nothing. No tightened jaw. No clenched fists. Just that flat, unreadable stare that had made lesser men confess to crimes they hadn't committed. His hands remained loose at his sides, his breathing steady, his expression empty of reaction. The stillness was more threatening than any verbal response could have been. O'Malley wanted rage. Instead, he got calculation. The insults escalated. O'Malley stepped closer, his breath hot with cigarettes and morning whiskey. He called Bumpy a monkey in a $1,000 suit. He questioned his right to stand on that sidewalk, to wear silk, to command respect in a neighborhood O'Malley considered his personal territory. Each word was designed to strip away dignity in front of witnesses who would spread the story through every barbershop and policy bank in Harlem. Bumpy's silence stretched into something almost violent. By refusing to engage, he was denying O'Malley's reality, dismissing the badge as irrelevant. The crowd sensed it. Marcus felt sweat despite the autumn air. Loretta Mae whispered a prayer. Jerome held his breath, waiting for the explosion that never came. At 2:51 p.m., as the church bell on 126th Street chimed the hour, O'Malley's palm cracked across Bumpy's face. The sound echoed off brick walls like a gunshot. The crowd flinched as one organism. From Bumpy's breast pocket, a crimson silk square fluttered downward, landing in the gutter dirt like a flag of surrender. O'Malley pointed at it, his voice dripping contempt. "Pick it up. On your knees, boy." The demand was worse than the slap. It was a command for public degradation, designed to break more than one man's spirit. Bumpy looked down at the square, then slowly back at O'Malley. He bent at the waist, avoiding the demanded knees. He retrieved the silk with 2 fingers, dusted it against his thigh with deliberate precision, refolded it along its original creases, and returned it to his pocket. He straightened his tie with mechanical care. When he spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless, final. "Captain O'Malley, you just signed something you can't read yet." 7 words. No threat, no anger. Just a statement of fact that drained color from O'Malley's face before his arrogance reasserted itself. He laughed, that ugly sound men make when convincing themselves they've won, climbed into his squad car, and drove away still chuckling. The whispers began before the car reached the intersection. Within minutes, the confrontation had reached every number spot in Harlem. By midnight, even the Italian families downtown knew what O'Malley had done. At 11:47 p.m., Bumpy sat alone at his kitchen table. A blank sheet of paper lay before him. His fountain pen hovered momentarily, then touched down. Respect is not requested. Bumpy Johnson conducted revenge the way architects designed cathedrals, with blueprints, calculations, and an understanding that the foundation determined everything that followed. He did not believe in rage. Rage was sloppy, imprecise, the domain of men who confused noise with power. At 1:15 a.m. Friday morning, he sat in the back room of a shuttered bar on Lenox Avenue, studying blueprints of the 32nd precinct spread across a scarred card table. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of deliberate planning. This wasn't about anger. This was about sending a message that would echo through every precinct in Manhattan for the next decade. The man studying the structural diagrams most carefully was Samuel Washington, though everyone called him the engineer. At 42, his hands could dismantle a German bunker or wire a building for controlled demolition with surgical precision. He had served in the Navy's construction battalion during the war, clearing beach obstacles at Normandy, diffusing unexploded ordnance in the Pacific. When he returned to New York in 1946, those skills meant nothing to employers who saw only his skin color. By 1947, he was working as a janitor and facing a murder charge after beating a white foreman who had called him boy one time too many. Bumpy made that charge disappear, gave Samuel steady work, and never asked him to compromise the precision that had kept him alive through 2 years of combat. Now Samuel owed him everything, and debts to Bumpy Johnson were always paid in full. The plan was surgical in its elegance. The fire would start in the evidence room at exactly 3:15 a.m., when only a skeleton crew occupied the building. Samuel traced ventilation shafts with his finger, explaining how smoke damage would ruin records before flames ever touched them. Accelerants would be placed along load-bearing walls to ensure structural damage while positioned away from sleeping quarters and holding cells. O'Malley's office on the second floor would receive special attention, with devices designed to incinerate paper records while leaving the brick shell intact. The goal was not mass destruction, but targeted humiliation. No casualties, no martyrs, just the systematic erasure of O'Malley's power base and every piece of evidence his department had collected against Bumpy's operations. While Samuel calculated burn rates and structural vulnerabilities, Bumpy's intelligence network had been gathering information with the thoroughness of a federal investigation. Street kids who shined shoes outside the precinct knew which officers worked overtime. Bartenders remembered off-duty conversations about gambling debts and family troubles. Hotel maids who cleaned rooms where cops met their mistresses collected fragments of private lives. By Thursday afternoon, Bumpy knew that O'Malley lived in a modest apartment in Queens, drove the same route to work every morning, owed nearly $4,000 to an Irish bookmaker in the Bronx, and kept a secretary named Patricia Donnelly in an apartment he rented under a false name. The fire was merely the opening statement in a longer conversation. Bumpy had decided that O'Malley would not die. Death was too simple, too clean, too final. O'Malley would live with the consequences of disrespect, would wake every morning and see the price of his arrogance reflected in his mirror. Smart violence meant destroying a man's reputation, his career, his sense of safety. It meant making him understand that the badge he wore offered no protection against consequences properly applied. The weapons Bumpy selected reflected this philosophy. No firearms. Guns were for amateurs who confused noise with power. Instead, a lead pipe wrapped in leather to prevent bone fragments while maximizing internal damage. Brass knuckles, heavy and unforgiving, for controlled facial fractures that would heal crooked. A straight razor honed to surgical sharpness, not for killing but for writing permanent messages in flesh, for letters and lines that no uniform could hide. These were instruments of policy, not passion, tools designed for precise damage that would serve as daily reminders. Thursday evening between 6 and 9 p.m., Bumpy made 3 visits to 3 different precinct captains who covered overlapping territories near Harlem. Each meeting followed the same script. He arrived alone, placed an envelope containing $5,000 on each captain's desk, and delivered a single sentence in his flat, emotionless tone. "Tomorrow, you'll understand why respect matters." The captains took the money. They understood the implicit message. Whatever was about to happen to O'Malley could happen to them if they forgot the old arrangements. By Friday morning, every police captain in Harlem would receive the lesson that cooperation had value and defiance had costs. At 2:33 a.m. Friday morning, Samuel Washington and 2 assistants slipped through a basement window of the 32nd Precinct. The janitor who left it unlocked had been on Bumpy's payroll for 3 years. A reliable man who understood that loyalty paid better than his city salary ever could. Samuel carried a canvas bag containing carefully measured accelerants, timing devices set with military precision, and wire cutters for the alarm system. They moved through the darkened basement with the confidence of men who understood that precision was the difference between success and catastrophe. They had exactly 42 minutes before the next patrol check. The devices were positioned with mathematical accuracy. The timers were synchronized. In the silence of the sleeping station house, the countdown began. At precisely 3:15 a.m., the first timer clicked in the evidence room's ventilation shaft. The ignition wasn't an explosion, but a whisper of controlled flame that caught the accelerant Samuel Washington had positioned with military precision. Within 90 seconds, the fire was feeding on cardboard evidence boxes stacked floor to ceiling, consuming arrest records and confiscated betting slips with terrifying efficiency. This wasn't the random hunger of accidental flame. This was surgical demolition, each tongue of fire following chemical trails laid like breadcrumbs through structural weak points, targeting specific rooms while avoiding others entirely. Officer Patrick Donnelly woke to smoke seeping under the second-floor bunk room door. He stumbled into the hallway in his underwear, shouting warnings that transformed the quiet station house into instant chaos. Men scrambled from beds, grabbing trousers but forgetting shirts, feet bare on linoleum that was already growing warm. The alarm system, its wires expertly severed, remained silent until someone manually triggered the emergency bell. By then, the evidence room was an inferno contained within brick walls, heat-reaching intensities that melted filing cabinets and turned decades of police work into ash. The fire department's response was mysteriously delayed by obstacles that appeared with suspicious timing. 2 blocks from the station, a delivery truck had jackknifed across the intersection, blocking the most direct route. 3 blocks in the other direction, a water main had burst, flooding the street and forcing engines to detour through narrow side streets. A parked car sat at precisely the wrong angle, forcing incoming vehicles to crawl through bottlenecks. These weren't coincidences. Every delay had been purchased, every obstacle positioned with the same care Samuel had applied to his devices. Despite the chaos, the precision held with mathematical certainty. The flames climbed upward through pre-identified weak points, consuming O'Malley's second-floor office where his blackmail files and personnel records turned to smoke that drifted out over Harlem. His mahogany desk, where he had burned Bumpy's money in righteous fury, became a smoking ruin. Every file cabinet containing evidence against Bumpy's organization was reduced to twisted metal and ash. Yet the holding cells remained untouched by flames, though smoke forced evacuations. The sleeping quarters suffered only minor damage. Officers escaped with singed eyebrows and major terror, but there were no bodies to carry out, no funerals to plan. When the roof over the evidence room finally collapsed at 3:48 a.m., it took with it every scrap of paper linking Bumpy Johnson to any crime committed in the last 5 years. Captain Gerald O'Malley arrived at 4:22 a.m., his personal vehicle screeching to a halt behind fire trucks, still pulling on his uniform jacket over pajamas. His face was the color of raw liver as he stood on the sidewalk, watching water cascade from broken windows, watching firefighters carry out smoking remnants of his professional life. He knew immediately who was responsible. The precision was Bumpy's signature. The timing was Bumpy's message. The problem was proof. He screamed at the fire chief, demanding answers, demanding arson investigations before the embers were even cold. His rage had no outlet, so it hardened into something colder and more dangerous. By dawn, Fire Marshal Anthony Caruso was walking through the gutted building with flashlight and clipboard, examining burn patterns with 3 decades of experience reading the stories flames told. His preliminary report, delivered at 5:45 a.m., was devastating in its mundane conclusion. Electrical failure in the basement junction box. Faulty wiring in an aging building that had been overloaded for years. Accelerated spread due to poor ventilation and combustible materials stored improperly. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of accelerants in the initial sweep. No witnesses reporting suspicious activity. The building had simply failed, the way old buildings sometimes did. Bumpy's people had done their work perfectly, leaving behind nothing but ash and plausible deniability. At 6:30 a.m., while O'Malley was still arguing with fire investigators in the smoking ruins of his kingdom, Bumpy Johnson walked into Sylvia's restaurant on Lenox Avenue. He wore a fresh navy blue suit with subtle pinstripes and a tie the color of old money. The morning newspaper lay open before him, displaying a photograph of the burning precinct house above the fold. He ordered coffee, scrambled eggs, and grits, sitting by the window where everyone could see him, surrounded by early morning diners who watched with a mixture of awe and knowing silence. He read the article with apparent interest, discussing the morning's news with the waitress who refilled his cup 3 times, establishing an ironclad alibi with every casual conversation. O'Malley heard about Bumpy's leisurely breakfast at 8:45 a.m. The news snapped something fundamental inside him. The lack of evidence didn't matter anymore. The fire marshal's report didn't matter. Procedure and law and constitutional protections didn't matter. He gathered 6 officers, men loyal enough or scared enough to follow him into hell, and drove toward Lenox Avenue. He would end this himself. He would drag Bumpy out in handcuffs or in a body bag, and the badge still gave him the authority to choose which. At 9:15 a.m., Sylvia's front door flew open with enough force to rattle the windows. O'Malley stormed in with his service revolver already drawn, his 6 officers fanning out with weapons leveled. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks clattered against plates. The silence was absolute, pregnant with the possibility of violence. Bumpy sat motionless in his window booth, coffee cup raised halfway to his lips, newspaper still open before him. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even turn around. His voice carried across the suddenly silent restaurant with perfect calm, addressing O'Malley's reflection in the window glass. "Captain, I heard about your fire. Terrible thing. Old buildings, you know." O'Malley's answer was wordless and final. His service weapon rose, trembling with rage and desperation, the barrel aimed at the back of Bumpy's head as his finger tightened on the trigger. The gun never fired, but violence arrived with mathematical precision. O'Malley crossed Sylvia's dining room in 4 measured strides, his service weapon returning to its holster as his closed fist became the instrument of his rage. The blow caught Bumpy on the left temple with the full weight of desperation and humiliation behind it. Blood appeared at his hairline, but he didn't fall, didn't flinch, didn't give O'Malley the satisfaction of reaction. He simply turned slowly in his seat, meeting the captain's eyes with that same empty stare that had preceded the fire. 30 witnesses watched the assault unfold, including City Councilman Robert Hayes finishing his morning coffee at the counter and Reverend Marcus Thompson with his deacon discussing Sunday's voter registration drive 2 tables away. Every person in that restaurant understood they were witnessing a police captain commit career suicide in real time. O'Malley dragged Bumpy from the booth without reading rights, without stating charges, without following any procedure except the ancient law of might making right. The handcuffs bit into Bumpy's wrists as he was shoved into the squad car, but his expression remained as calm as if he were being escorted to church. He had calculated this moment, had anticipated O'Malley's breakdown, had prepared for exactly this kind of desperate overreach. The captain was doing Bumpy's work for him, destroying his own credibility with every violation of procedure. The detention lasted exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes in a temporary holding facility established after the fire. Bumpy sat on a wooden bench, dabbing blood from his lip with his silk handkerchief, waiting with the patience of a man who knew the outcome before the game began. O'Malley screamed accusations he couldn't prove and made threats he couldn't legally enforce, but Bumpy answered none of the questions and reacted to none of the insults. At 1:32 p.m., a court clerk arrived with a writ of habeas corpus signed by Judge Harold Morrison, citing improper arrest procedure, lack of probable cause, and unlawful detention without counsel. Morrison had been on Bumpy's payroll since 1948, a pragmatic arrangement that served both their interests when constitutional law needed reinforcement. Bumpy walked out the front door while O'Malley watched helplessly, understanding that every institution he trusted had been purchased before he even knew the game was being played. By Friday afternoon, Harlem's political machinery had mobilized with impressive coordination. Ministers called press conferences demanding O'Malley's removal. The NAACP filed formal complaints about police brutality witnessed by 36 citizens. Councilman Hayes made speeches about constitutional violations and racial targeting. The pressure was real, the outrage genuine, but Bumpy had already moved beyond politics and procedure. He respected their efforts but operated on a different level entirely. The law could argue about policies and reforms. He dealt in consequences. The slap on 125th Street had been public. The fire had been symbolic. The arrest at Sylvia's had been theatrical. None of it had altered O'Malley's fundamental belief that his badge made him untouchable. That belief had to die completely. The man could live. The belief could not. At 11:34 p.m., Gerald O'Malley stumbled out of his mistress's apartment building on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, alone and drunk on whiskey that hadn't dulled his fury. Patricia Donnelly had refused to let him stay the night, frightened by his ranting about burning Harlem to the ground, about teaching those people their place once and for all. He walked toward his car parked 3 blocks away, his badge still clipped to his belt, his service revolver heavy against his hip. These items provided the illusion of protection, the delusion that authority extended beyond jurisdiction, beyond accountability, beyond the reach of men who understood that respect was not negotiable. The alley behind the closed speakeasy was darker than the surrounding darkness, a pocket of absolute black between streetlights that should have warned him. O'Malley never saw the first blow, just felt his legs buckle as something heavy connected with his kidneys. He went down on broken asphalt, his gun torn from its holster before his hand could reach it. Through the haze of pain and shock, Bumpy Johnson stepped into his field of vision, flanked by 2 men whose faces remained in shadow. There was no anger in Bumpy's expression, no satisfaction, just the calm focus of a craftsman beginning necessary work. They started with his hands, and the process was methodical, systematic, accompanied by Bumpy's flat voice counting each break with mathematical precision. The right hand first, fingers spread against the pavement while one enforcer held him down. The lead pipe, wrapped in leather to muffle sound, came down with measured force on each finger in sequence. O'Malley screamed into a gag that tasted of motor oil and desperation, but the breaking continued with mechanical efficiency. The left hand followed the same procedure, 10 fingers reduced to useless appendages that would never again hold a service weapon steady, never again sign arrest warrants, never again strike a man in public. This was the hand that had slapped Bumpy on 125th Street. This was the hand that had accepted envelopes and then burned them in righteous fury. Bumpy ensured it would never hold anything steady again. The razor work came next, and this was deeply personal. Bumpy held O'Malley's face steady while the straight blade traced letters across his left cheek with surgical precision. Not deep enough to kill or even require extensive stitching, but permanent nonetheless. The word formed slowly, each letter a reminder that would greet O'Malley every morning in his shaving mirror for the rest of his life. RESPECT. The captain had stopped screaming by then, reduced to whimpering sobs that Bumpy ignored with professional detachment. This wasn't about cruelty. This was about education. about ensuring that the lesson would be visible to every person who looked at Gerald O'Malley for the remainder of his days. The note was pinned to O'Malley's chest with a hat pin through his uniform shirt, careful to avoid piercing skin. The message was handwritten in the same fountain pen ink Bumpy had used Thursday night. Respect is not requested. It is enforced. EJ. They left him conscious, broken but breathing, in the alley where he would be found by men who would understand exactly what had happened and why. At 2:47 a.m., Officer Michael Riley discovered his captain during a routine patrol, calling for an ambulance that rushed O'Malley to Harlem Hospital. The bitter irony wasn't lost on anyone that he would be treated in the neighborhood he had terrorized by black doctors and nurses who provided professional care despite knowing exactly what he represented. The police response was massive and completely impotent. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, finding no witnesses willing to remember anything. The alley yielded no evidence beyond O'Malley's blood and the lingering scent of leather and fear. At the exact time of the attack, Bumpy Johnson had been playing chess at the Harlem Social Club with Father Michael O'Brien and two retired schoolteachers, a game that lasted from 10 p.m. until 2 a.m., with 14 witnesses who would swear to his presence with unwavering certainty. In his hospital bed at 4:15 a.m., both hands encased in plaster casts that rendered him as helpless as an infant, O'Malley stared at his reflection in the darkened window. The morphine dulled the throbbing in his fingers but couldn't touch the burning on his face. The razor scars were covered in bandages, but he could feel them burning, could imagine the letters that would define his face forever. A night nurse entered quietly, placing a vase of white lilies on the bedside table with hands that trembled slightly. She had recognized him, knew what he had done to her neighborhood, but professionalism demanded courtesy. "These just arrived for you, Captain," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "There's a card." O'Malley couldn't pick it up with his shattered hands. He could only stare as she turned it over for him to read. The handwriting was elegant, familiar from the note that had been pinned to his chest. "Get well soon. A concerned citizen of Harlem." He closed his eyes, finally understanding that some lessons couldn't be unlearned and some debts could never be repaid. The badge that had given him authority was still clipped to his torn uniform, but it had become nothing more than tin and illusion. Respect, he now understood, was the only currency that mattered, and his account had been permanently closed. The administrative machinery moved with bureaucratic precision, not out of justice, but out of institutional self-preservation. On Tuesday, August 19th, 5 days after his discharge from Harlem Hospital, Gerald O'Malley received transfer orders that buried him in a basement office in Queens, processing parking violations and reviewing overtime requests with hands that could barely hold a pen. The department cited medical necessity, but everyone understood the mathematics of liability. A precinct captain whose face advertised his failure in raised scar tissue and whose station house had burned under mysterious circumstances was a problem that required quiet elimination. By February 1953, Internal Affairs had compiled enough evidence of procedural violations and excessive force complaints to force early retirement. His pension was reduced by 40% under provisions designed for disgraced officers, a final bureaucratic insult that stripped away his financial security along with his badge. The ripple effect through the NYPD was immediate and absolute. Within 72 hours of O'Malley's hospitalization, every precinct captain covering Harlem territory had restored the old arrangements with mathematical precision. The envelopes that had paused during O'Malley's crusade reappeared on Monday morning desks, delivered by the same runners to the same offices, as if his 8-month war against corruption had been nothing more than a brief interruption in natural order. Captains who had considered following O'Malley's example looked at photographs of his scarred face and decided that moral clarity wasn't worth the demonstrated price. The system reasserted itself because the alternative had been proven too costly in fire and blood. 2 weeks after O'Malley's transfer, Captain Anthony Russo sat across from Bumpy Johnson in the back room of a closed restaurant on 132nd Street. Russo was third-generation Italian from Brooklyn, a pragmatic man who understood that authority meant nothing without respect, and respect required understanding your limitations. He placed a thick manila envelope on the scarred wooden table between them, $500 representing acknowledgement of how business would be conducted. Bumpy regarded the envelope for a long moment, then slid it back across the table with 2 fingers, his voice carrying no emotion, just the flat certainty of a man who had already won every negotiation before it began. Keep it for a month. Consider it a gift. I just want you to remember what happened to the man who forgot his manners. Russo understood immediately. The refusal wasn't rejection, but education. Bumpy was establishing that respect came before money, that their arrangement would be built on mutual understanding rather than simple transaction. The captain nodded once, pocketed the envelope, and left with the knowledge that he would never make O'Malley's mistake. The incident solidified Bumpy's reputation as untouchable in ways that decades of successful criminal enterprise never could. He had taken on a police captain, destroyed him systematically, and emerged without legal consequences. Even corrupt cops understood that Bumpy operated on a different level entirely. There was an unspoken agreement that rippled through every precinct in Manhattan. You could arrest his runners, you could raid his operations for show, but you never disrespected the man himself. In Harlem, crowds parted when he walked down 125th Street, not from fear alone, but from something closer to reverence. He was the professor, the man who had taught the white establishment that dignity in their neighborhood had consequences attached to it. Gerald O'Malley never recovered from the lesson Bumpy taught him. His hands healed crooked despite surgery, leaving him unable to grip a fork properly or button his own shirt. The facial scars faded slightly but remained visible, the word carved into his cheek like a permanent brand. He started drinking seriously in 1953, trying to drown memories that wouldn't die. By 1957, he was dead at 51, his liver destroyed and his spirit broken years before his body finally surrendered. Bumpy Johnson continued as Harlem's unofficial mayor until his death in 1968, commanding respect from criminals and law enforcement with equal authority. In 1965, sitting across from a young Frank Lucas in the back room of a social club, Bumpy recounted that August day with the detached precision of a professor delivering a lecture. They think respect is about fear. It's not. It's about consequences. You teach men that actions have consequences, and they learn to think before they act. That captain learned. Every cop in New York learned. And for 15 years after that, no one ever raised a hand to me again. That's not power, boy. That's respect. And respect is the only currency that matters in this world.